good practice for accepting what we can't control. Accepting it is so out there, but we can change our attitude through which we approach things like self-work and astrology and dealing with others, acknowledging other souls, they exist, you know, which is kind of hard to do in a Western framework sometimes. But then to, you know, say that all of our, another thing the West gets wrong is that they like to convince us that our answers are all out there, you know? And again, in the East, they're good at humbling us in a very stoic sort of way by saying that our tools are right here, they're innate. We have everything we need to cultivate an accurate perspective of ourselves and of how reality works, you know? And so I think that's what the birth chart represents. It represents our innate coding, set of predispositions for responding to the world. And it gives us foresight about how to know, about knowing how it is that we react to certain kinds of things. So it depends what you want to do. Obviously, based on that kind of philosophical grounding, when you go to a Vedic astrologer, they're going to tell you how it's going to be and what to do. You know, as a Western astrologer, I like to say, I don't tell you what to do, I help you own what you do better. Because you can't control externals, but you can know yourself and own your thoughts and your actions and your words in a way that's more conducive to flourishing for you and for all. You know? So yeah, when we talk about things like Vedics and a lot of like evolutionary Western astrologers too talk about things like past lives. You know, I wonder if that's actually helpful, because one of the reasons you go to an astrologer is to figure out what's going on in this life, you know? I think it's one way of conceptualizing those challenges that are going to come up that we have to deal with before we are able to achieve our purpose and aim ourselves on our righteous path, you know? And so South Node or Ketu in Vedic, they represent the same thing. They're just two different ways of explaining them. If you enjoy, I think it's a matter of preference, if you enjoy the imagery of having past life explanations for helping you to understand the challenges in the first quarter to half of life, I think that's fine, but it's not for everyone, you know? And I think the style that you prefer is actually indicated by your birth chart, you know, by your sets of proclivities. It's another thing that came up in philosophy when I was studying philosophy is why are there so many schools of thought, and why are there, you know, so many schools of thought and ways of thinking about things like metaphysics and morality that just don't interest me at all? Like, I'd rather take this other path. And it turns out that there's an overrepresentation of certain signs or certain house placements in certain schools of thought. There's been limited research done on this statistically, but I do have kind of a fancy schmancy astrologer's software program with a big library of birth charts, you know, and included are a lot of like writers and philosophers of the past and present. And you find that there's an abundance of Piscean and 12th house energy in things like existential philosophy. And you find that there's more Capricorn 10th house energy in things like logical positivism, you know? And it would make sense based on the kinds of, you know, other things that those signs and major heavy house charts prefer. And you look at things like stand-up comedy. There's an overabundance of Gemini type people in stand-up comedy.
The twins, yeah.
Exactly, the twins, yeah, having a debate within its own head, right? Being hyper concerned with information, with fact gathering, with words. It's about like having each word in its right place and shifting things around to make it the funniest, you give the funniest and weirdest delivery possible. Gemini's offbeat, it's unpredictable, you know? That's what you get in stand-up comedy is like incongruity kind of lies at the basis of what's funny, right? You're set up, a joke is worded in a certain way to lead you to believe that you're going to get one result, and then they come out of nowhere, and the punchline, there's a little shock value, incongruity between what you get and what you expected, you know? And that's kind of what humor is. We find funny things that we didn't expect, you know? So Gemini is good at, you know, creatively composing that kind of thing, you know? Same thing with Aries energy in extreme sports. Aries people like to just run into things head on, just ram it, like act first, think later, you know? Learn all your lessons the hard way, you know, like through physical exertion, right? And so that's how you have to be in extreme sports. You have to be fearless, you know, you have to have a warrior mindset, kind of like reckless mindset, but there is a level of finesse that comes along with that, you know, with skill. You know, if you manage to develop those skills enough before you break too many bones and just, you know, become paralyzed. But, you know, somehow Aries people can just keep hammering away at their task, and they're physically tough, and they have an abundance of physical energy, you know. Another thing I wanted to talk about is, you know, philosophically, it's interesting that each of the signs are an evolution in some ways of the sign before it, but it kind of overcorrects for the thing that the sign before it lacks. And we like to think that by the time we get to the end, from Aries, the youngest soul of the zodiac, so to speak, you know, that kind of just rams into things, we get to Pisces, and Pisces tries to take a very broad, holistic view of the world, and wants everyone to be happy and involved, but is also has a nice combination of being, you know, self-concerned. So is both introspective as well as outwardly focused. But we find that, you know, Pisces has their own set of problems. You know, it's not necessarily that they break a lot of bones like Aries skateboarder, you know, but they have more kind of existential type issues. And so everyone has issues, you know, there's no one sign, you know, Capricorn needs to loosen up, you know, Aquarius needs to, you know, not be so weird. We can go on and on, right? But we find there is an evolution from Aries to Taurus. It's very obvious because those are two of the, I guess, simpler signs we could say to understand. Aries has a lot of physical energy. Taurus has a lot of physical energy. Aries exerts it. Taurus conserves it. All right? So they become too fixed sign, too fixed, too grounded sometimes, too, you know, not taking in action that they should, or not decisive enough, you know? And so Aries is like hyper decisive. Taurus looks back at Aries and says, whoa, dude, that's too much. I'm just gonna stay put. I'm gonna be a nice ox or bull grazing in the field, slowly, carefully, you know? And then that heavy grounding, heaviest animal of all the symbols of the zodiac, turns into Gemini, which just floats up into space. Mutable, no rules, no, you know, no strict confines, but likes to explore things of the ether. But they get lost in space, Gemini. That's the drawback, right? They come out of being too fixed in Taurus and go into being sort of too ether. If you have a lot of air in your chart, you're up in your head a lot. Any comments or questions so far? No, I'm like connecting a lot of dots, taking a stream of consciousness, you know? That's how I like to do these things.
Behind you on the wall, you have that the pie.
Oh yeah.
Is that the chart?
So this is just a really crappy drawing. Oh, thank you. It doesn't. But thank you.
Uniquely cooperation of who's going to be the person, the street, location, time, So I had trouble, I don't know what time I was born.
Oh, you don't?
Yeah, but
Do you have like a range, like an estimated time?
not even that.
So there's this whole area of astrology called rectification,
Yeah.
and it's quite a process to dig up somebody's chart info if you don't have an exact time. Usually, if you're born in a hospital that's part of a hospital system, like I've had clients before who, one in particular that comes to mind, she didn't know her exact birth time. She thought she had a range for it, but that turned out to be inaccurate. And she couldn't find her birth certificate, and your birth time's not always on your birth certificate either, right? So the hospital, she tried to call the hospital that she was born at to see if they had the record of it, which usually works, by the way. That's a great.
Oh, it does?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
If no one else has it, they will, or the Department of Vital Statistics will have it at the courthouse or the archives or whatever, and you're in the hometown where you were born. So either or, those are really the two best ways to figure it out. But the hospital that she was born at had burnt down. So then she tried to contact the hospital system, and they were like, well, the hospital burnt down, we lost all the records too. So I was like, nice, because it was before they had everything logged in computers.
That's right.
Yeah. So that was a pain. But then her dad ended up finding her birth certificate and it had the time on it, so it was all good. But the rectification process, we're not getting into that right now, but there are ways to kind of predict through inquiry, like it requires its own, session or series of sessions in order to figure out where the ascendant is. Because this is what changes every 2 hours, And so if you're even a few minutes off, that could mean having a different ascendant sign, which means that in one sign, it's a very late degree ascendant. In the next sign, it's going to be a very early degree ascendant. And if it's in that later degree, early sign before, then if you move into like a whole sign house system, it's going to change everything in the chart. So you're not going to know where everything is supposed to be. And it's a huge pain. But did you have any specific questions, Gene, about this pie?
Okay, well,
I'm going to start drawing on it in a minute.
I'm looking at it, but it's just a circle.
Yeah.
But I see what you're saying. It's leading towards astronomy.
Yeah,
I feel that I know nothing of it.
We use astronomical tactics to produce a birth chart, to lay it out. And you can do it placing more emphasis on time or space or rulership, which is what whole sign house systems do. It's just like locking things into place so everything's neat and tidy. And it turns out whole sign, without going into too much detail, whole sign is it's like this nice middle ground that traditional Hellenistic astrologers use. They typically use whole sign system. And it's a good middle ground between Western and Eastern. But I find that it depends on the goals that you're trying to set in your astrological work. That should determine to some degree which house system you're using. I find that Porphyry and Placidus are actually better at strict psychological description, like describing the different parts of your perception and how you see the world, whereas whole sign and Vedic also are better at predicting events, things like that. So I don't claim to be a psychic. I think real psychic ability is quite rare, and I tend not to dabble in the black magic yet. But maybe someday, who knows where the journey will take me.
Wait.
Yeah. There's, at the end of this road for me is like this upside down cross, right?
Yeah.
Nice story. That's what it looks like.
Well, thank you. So, what to talk about next? So yeah, pop astrology in the West. We talked earlier about how Western's very outward focused, but self-absorbed, on the individual level. So on a cultural level, it's no coincidence that sun sign astrology is really the main thing, because the sun represents your ego and who it is you want to be and what your energy source is like. And it's the thing that everything else revolves around, right? That's kind of how the ego sees itself. And then the sign that it's in represents the style of expression, swagger, the fashion that you use. You know, your ascendant sign literally represents your fashion sense. You know, like I'm a Capricorn ascendant. Look at these shoes. I've had these since I was in 8th grade. They're extremely functional. They have great foot support. They're very grounding. They're comfy too. Something an Earth sign would like. You know.
Right.
There's nothing aesthetically pleasing about them, you know, and Capricorn tends not to be too concerned about that, you know. Capricorn likes more sort of refined, simple, darker, earthy styles of expression.
But they were good quality or they wouldn't have lasted.
Were? What do you mean? They'll always be good quality. But ruling planet, Capricorn, Saturn, right? So Saturn is very concerned with things that last, right? The old grandfather is trying to build a fortress, build an empire for legacy, you know, so that his family has a foundation, so that, you know, society has a foundation. And he wants things to last, and when he makes a purchase, he can be very frugal with his money, but that's how he got to where he's at, right, is by saving. You make money by saving money and investing it wisely, rather than by frivolous spending like Venus often wants to do, especially if it's in a sign, like a more mutable type sign, you know. And so again, like these symbols and metaphors all kind of fit together. But you know, even though I'm not a grandfather yet, I like this kind of stuff, you know? A nice Saturday evening for me is something like a Capricorn heavy person would enjoy, having a scotch by the fire in an old, you know, wooden den. Yeah. So, so these themes are pretty obvious, but yeah. So in the West, we put a lot of emphasis on style, on fashion, and that's kind of what your sign, the sign of any given planet, represents the style of expression of that particular part of yourself, right? The planet is the part of yourself. The sign is the style of expression, and then the house, let's say we got Venus, and the 5th house in Pisces. So the house is the area of life, the context of life in which that part of yourself in that style is most prominently expressed. Yeah. So we're not going too deep into houses today, but 5th house represents leisure, fun, creativity, children, right? And the reason children and leisure and fun happen in the same house is because playing with your kids and entertaining them, and also even Saturn things, even though that doesn't have anything to do with the 5th house in this case, setting boundaries around those kinds of things is important. Because if you have a Venus in the 5th house and it's not connected to Saturn, or Saturn doesn't have a prominent placement in your chart, you can get lost in the fun aspect of kids and lack the discipline, you know? And so that's why finding balance in everything is so important. So this person's going to be really interested in having a good time with their kids in early life, at the very least, probably more casual flings, in romance, and just kind of living day by day. and not having lots of limits placed on how they like to express themselves creatively and into things that they like. And then in the sign of Pisces, that's going to give an extra boost as far as the creative and ethereal and kind of metaphysical minded approach to things like creativity. It may be something like music that they're into rather than visual art. Visual art is more of an earthy type pursuit, so that would indicate the style and the kinds of ways in which you'd like to express these things of the fifth house through that thing that's trying to express them inside of you, which is the expressive social planet too, Venus. And also in terms of friendships and things, although you like there not to be too many responsibilities attached to your social dealings, you want there to be a level of depth to the connection, because Pisces seeks a lot of depth and breadth and meaning in their connection. So it's just like one example of a placement, how I would interpret it anyway, So there's, a lot more than just your sun sign. There are really only a handful of things, I believe, that each of the sun signs has in common. And we can look at what the kinds of things that the ruling planets represent in order to get a sense of that, So Cancer, or I'm a Cancer sun sign, but I still haven't mastered the Cancer, and we'll put we'll connect it with a little heart. The moon. Okay. Good enough, right? So the moon represents things like home grounding, especially for a man, relationship to the mother, but also for a woman too, just in a different way. Gender differences in astrology are super interesting because men and women are different. They have different ways of expressing things like moon and Cancer, But for a Cancer sun person, the moon is super important because that's the ruling planet of Cancer. And so for, say, a Cancer sun man like me, for example, even though I have a lot of Capricorn, it might not be obvious, how I think and feel and process things is directly connected to my relationship with the concept of home. And so Cancer sun people are always searching for a home, searching for a shell to crawl into. And because the moon, the home-based planet, we could say, is the ruling planet, the moon is super important. So that makes Cancer sun a very introverted style of personality. And so there's not too much more that like all Cancers have in common, all Cancer sun people, other than the fact they're always seeking a home, a new shell to crab into. And they have different ways of going about that depending on what their moon sign is. They have different emotional means of expression depending on what their moon sign is. They say that Cancers are really emotional, but I would prefer the term sensitive, more sensitive to its environment, kind of in tune to the things around it in its environment that could potentially provide a home for it, because that's what they're looking to do with their environment, is create a home out of something and nest in something. And so they're sensitive to the things that will serve them in that way or not, and their emotionality is really just dependent on their moon sign. If you have a double Cancer person, that's going to be a highly emotional person because they're highly sensitive, and sensitive people tend to react emotionally to things. But for example, like, I'm kind of an exception to the rule, like, not that I'm a sociopath or anything like that, but my moon sign's in the 12th house, which seems like a sensitive place, but it's in the sign of Capricorn as well.
Okay.
So it provides a balance for my sun, which is over in the 6th house. This looks more like the thing I'm trying to draw than like a lot of other things that I'm trying to draw. Anyway. It provides a lot of balance, but it also provides a lot of tension, all right? So someone with an opposition between their sun and their moon, in two very different signs, we think of Cancer and Capricorn as opposite signs, but really they're complementary. They give each other the perfect balance that they need, and that's based on the archetypes that they represent, which sun is father, moon is mother, but then Cancer is the mother of the zodiac, and Capricorn's kind of the father of the zodiac. That's the axis, the paternal axis of the zodiac, right? Whereas if you look at Gemini and Sagittarius, they're opposites. That's more about information and understanding things. Gemini is about the facts, gathering the facts and wordplay, understanding language. Sagittarius is about connecting dots. It's about seeing the bigger picture, you know. So this is where aspects come in, and aspects are a whole other thing in the 3rd week. And by the way, any of these talks can stand alone. You know, you don't have to attend all 3 of them. I think maybe I didn't like really put that on the flyer, so maybe some people were deterred from coming here because they couldn't attend all 3. You know, but anyway, the aspects are important because they show the relationships between these crucial parts of ourselves, and that provides a new energy, a new insight into like an internal relationship that we have with 2 different parts of our perception and psyche, you know. And so an opposition is, you know, is striving toward balance, but it also plays tug of war because it means that your emotional and processing center and your energy outputting center or conserving center are playing tug of war with each other. You know, they're struggling for power, they're struggling for balance, but there is perfect balance to be found, you know. So, you know, we'll talk about, I could talk about oppositions all day because I will have Cancer and Capricorn stuff. But yeah, so Cancer, back to the like original point I was talking about, Cancer Sun. They're always trying to find a home, and that can be difficult when your home planet is playing tug of war with that energy source, right? Look at Virgo. Virgo can be seen and is often seen as too picky, right?
Virgo sun, so yeah, I've heard it all.
Yeah, you've heard it all, right? But really, like, one of the main concerns for a Virgo sun is that you're turning dials in order to improve things, you know? You have, like, maybe a general understanding of how intricacies work. And Virgos tend to make really good editors and tend to be able to do a lot of mundane type work that other people don't want to do, but it has a bigger picture focus driving it. And that's improvement, you know. And I think to some degree and in some style, every single sign is trying to improve things, improve themselves, improve whatever system is there that they have to take responsibility for, you know. Now, you have another little philosophical way of understanding a birth chart. A lot of people like to do something like this. First house. Oh God, I'm mixing colors. Green and red make brown, right? A lot of people like to do this. Understand the first house in terms of Aries. They like to marry the first house in Aries, even if your first house is not in Aries. as a general rule, I would strongly consider to not do that. Don't marry Aries with the first house, Capricorn with the 10th house, even though they're overlapping significations, right? But if we want to get the most out of our birth chart learning experience, we have to deal with the information that's right in front of us that we can actually see in our birth chart as it pertains to us and in the ways that whatever it is we're trying to do with that information, So while there are overlapping traits of Aries and significations of the first house, for example, being sort of self-concerned, really self and identity, that highly individualistic approach that Aries takes to everything it does, that comes in part from not really thinking before it acts, right? It overlaps with the first house because the first house deals with the self and physical appearance and your identity and how it is that you see yourself. But if you don't have Aries in the first house, you're not going to gain too much by marrying those things, because you want to be able to understand what a sign is and what a house is. And if you always associate these two things, then you're not really going to get the most out of understanding Aries as an archetype for a style of expressing a certain planet or a certain house. If you have Aries in the 3rd house or the 8th house, you're not going to be able to cross that knowledge over and apply it to other parts of the chart when it's necessary, which is going to be necessary at least 11 out of 12 times, because it's only 1 out of 12 times that Aries is actually in the first house. We're not talking about extreme sports dudes. It's maybe more often, we see it. And then, similarly, Capricorn in the 10th house, it's so tempting, right? Because Capricorn is represented by the goat. The goat is just swiftly, strategically striding up the mountain, up to the peak of its mountain, and just so it can get up there and look down on its surroundings and say, I did that, So it can bask in the glory of its achievements, And that's what the goat does, and that's more of a Capricorn thing than a midheaven 10th house thing, which represents our highest purpose, our own personal mountain that we're trying to climb. But if you don't have Capricorn in the 10th house, then you don't have a swift goat type style of achieving those things of the midheaven, of your personal mountain. Maybe you have Pisces up there, very different, which indicates that your purpose isn't going to be about, let's say, getting up there and are achieving things just to say that you did, right? Which is kind of what Capricorn gets trapped in. It loves to